whatever happens, make sure you're playing well. You can win a game, but you play like shit, and you can still examine it and feel bad about it, and then learn from it. Whereas you can conversely play a game tremendously, get destroyed, and still feel satisfied and be like, okay, I did that thing right. I did that thing right. That's probably the best way to play the game. Play to get better and play for yourself. Play to have fun. Imagine everyone else is just an NPC in a game.
Welcome to Challenger Insights, where we dive into the minds of the best League of Legends players to figure out how they think about the game. I'm your host, Lucas, and today I'm joined by Azzapp. He's a Challenger Vel'Koz mid-main. He's been in the top 200 since Season 3, reaching Triple Challenger in Europe West, Nordic East and NA, and he's reached rank 19 on the Europe West leaderboard. Before we get started, I'm also hosting a live Q&A with Azzapp in the Challenger Insights Discord. It'll be happening tomorrow, November 12th at 1 p.m. Central Time or 7 p.m. in the UK. So if you want to ask Azzapp some questions of your own, be sure to join the Discord. The link for that will be in the show notes. Azzapp, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Lucas, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, man.
Awesome. So let's get started. How would you describe Vel'Koz in your own words?
Well, Valka is just absolutely awesome. I would describe him as the best designed character in the game. It's a tentacle monster that's hungry for knowledge. It's just he has the most, in my opinion, unique kit in the entire game. That's just so unique and it has infinite potential, essentially.
Okay. Can you talk about that infinite potential? What does that mean?
It means that you could play him in the highest range of possible plays. It's a weird thing where you try to define difficulty of something. Like how would you program, let's say, a perfect player of a single champion? You can imagine for Garen it would be easy, but for Vel'Koz it would be so damn difficult because there's infinite amount of variables that go in, like the 360-degree angle where you could shoot, the timing of the recast of the abilities. So yeah, there's a lot of potential plays, and that's even without going into the mind games and everything.
Huh. Okay, that's interesting. In that case, if there's so many different ways to play him, what makes your playstyle unique compared to how other people might play him?
I try to take the learning approach, I guess. I don't really do too much aggressive plays because Vel'Koz is not really a huge playmaker. He is, but he's not flashy. Most of the plays are kind of made in your head before they happen. So you're gonna make a play, but it will be fully calculated in advance, and it's just gonna be like running a certain protocol. You're gonna play versus, let's say, Vladimir, and you can't really kill him unless he uses a pool and flash. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna try to bait one combo so you can bait out his pool, then you can force his flash in another subsequent combo, and then you have to repeat that so he doesn't have flash so you can kill him. And it's one of those checklist things where you're just trying to operate on enemy mistakes. There are obviously plays you can make to prime him into a mistake, but usually that's kind of what you depend on. So what you just do is usually play the game in the most correct way possible, like technically, just farming, wave management, all sort of stuff, and then you look for opportunities. So I guess I take a bit more like passive approach in such a way while I just try to figure out exact patterns that could work on the possible enemy.
Huh, that's interesting. So you're constantly just thinking about essentially like a, a checklist of things to do before you can go for a kill, for example.
Yeah, exactly. You just have to like keep track of every dash flash ability, the gap closer, and you also I guess what makes me a bit unique is I played other champs quite a lot. In older seasons, I used to play a lot of other champs, and I used to be good at them, and I can probably play them now even at a very very high level. So I kind of understand what the goal of certain characters is, and the best way to counterplay someone is to actually understand what they're gonna do. So just by predicting what their goal is, you can kind of play on the edge and manipulate that goal and abuse them, I guess.
I like this. This seems very on brand for Vel'Koz to not only make such calculated plays, but also to gather the intelligence on on how enemy champions might play. I love that. Cool. What are some of the common mistakes that you see other Vel'Koz players make that you know how to avoid?
They die a lot. So the thing is, I usually tell people when they try to get better, like the rule number one is don't die. It works extraordinarily well for any sort of AD carry player trying to learn mage players and especially Vel'Koz players. Because your core purpose is just not to die, and as a Vel'Koz, you have the luxury of actually hitting the front line due to your true damage. So you don't really care that much who you're hitting. Like, obviously, there are going to be certain scenarios, but usually it's fine to hit the front line. So your core purpose is to survive and have really good positioning in a team fight. So that's one of the core mistakes people make, but that's more like a League of Legends based mistake, general. For Vel'Koz, I would say people do dry combos way too much. What I mean by that is they're gonna try to do EW combo or WE or EWR without prefixing that with the Q. And Q is the core ability of the kit, and it's an incredible manipulative tool. So if you do a dry combo EW, it's just so unlikely to land. It's pretty much pointless. You're just wasting lane pressure, you're wasting mana, making yourself vulnerable because now you don't have a defensive ability available. So it's like a whole plethora of problems coming just from that. So dry combos are very rarely like useful, only like when enemies maybe overstep for like a cannon and they kind of telegraph they're gonna auto attack you, so you want to do a fast combo without your Q, but usually it's just best not to do it.
Okay. In that case, what do your combos look like, and how do you integrate the queue into that?
Well, I made probably one of my most famous videos is like the 10 combos of Vel'Koz. He has way more combos. He's a rather complex champion. It feels simple on the surface, but there's so many different things. It's kind of difficult without the visuals here. But there are like variants where you use your Q as a shepherding tool, essentially. You're gonna shoot it at a wide angle, which is gonna push enemies to walk towards you. And even before they do that, you're gonna instantly cast EW on the ground, like where you assume that they're gonna be. You're gonna be like a shepherd dog, just push him towards one area where you want him to. Yeah, you can use minions because people are usually gonna duck behind the minions, so you're gonna try to aim at the full wave while zoning with the Q. You can land the Q, which gives you a slow. So the Q is either a slow or like a zone tool. And either way, your combo subsequently is much easier to land, which is why dry combos are just really, really bad.
That's interesting. So, am I getting this right that you're almost always using Q at the start so that you can land your other abilities?
Exactly. There are certain variants where, again, you can mix it up because your W has no cast time. It's the only ability without cast time. You can cast it while moving, essentially. So it's a good thing to mask abilities. You can do W and Q instantly, and they're going to kind of shoot at the same time. And if enemies aren't paying attention, the particle effects are going to kind of be jumbled up together. And if they're not really paying attention, you can kind of catch them off guard with that Q and then do another EW, because then you have two W stacks.
That's cool. When you do this, like you mentioned hiding the Q, but if people are paying enough attention, aren't you going to miss Q a lot if that's the first ability you use? Like, you use it as a shepherding tool, which I assume means it's not too big of a deal if it misses, I guess. Am I getting that right?
Yes, it all depends what your goal is, and your goal can depend on the enemy HP, on the stacks enemy has right now. If enemy has one stack, you don't necessarily care that much because you can proc 6 fairly easily with that. Because it's all about rotations. You need to land like 3 stacks and 6. You want to end up on one of those two spots. So if you land your Q, it's pretty easy to land everything else, and you're gonna get 6. But if you miss your Q, you gotta make sure you have enough stacks on the enemy, or he's low enough HP so the rest of the combo can finish him up. So depending on the situation, it could be like a really bad deal if you miss the Q, but not necessarily because maybe you planned kinda to make him dodge into your rest of the combo if you deem it worth.
Yeah, I like that. That's really cool. Actually, I have a question then about the passive stacks as well. How important is it to keep track or like prepare stacks on the enemy? And also, I know that the auto keeps the stacks on the enemy. Is that important to you? Is that something that you try to maintain?
Yeah, exactly. That's where the higher level of Vel'Koz players come in, and stacks are extremely important. Good players are gonna know how many stacks they have, how many they can get, and you really need to count them. And like usually versus tanks, you're gonna need 3 rotations, which is 9 stacks. Versus squishies, you're gonna need 6. Sometimes versus like supports, when you're high level, you can just get them in 3. So yeah, the idea is to count stacks and prepare them. So there's a couple of very interesting variants where you kind of use your stacks against the enemy. So let's say you're fighting versus a Tryndamere or a Zillion or a Kindred, someone with the invulnerability ability. You're gonna set up on 2 stacks, and kind of just auto-attack them slowly to the point where you're gonna one-shot them with the Q proc. And then try to execute them without them pressing their ultimate saving ability. So that's one of the variants where you can manipulate the stacks in your favor. Now, conversely, if they use the ability, let's say Zillion presses ult, you're not gonna proc your true damage, you're gonna set it up to 2 stacks and wait out the ult. Same with the Kindred, same with the Tryndamere, same with the Kale. You're just kinda, you have a privilege to shift your damage spike, damage burst, on one side or the other. So either try to kill him before the ult or right after. So that's for the first part of the question. The second part is the auto attacks, which are tremendously important because your brunt of the damage comes from passive. So usually when that is super useful is when you do extended trades, and that's about level 6. Usually when you're about to level up to level 6, you're going to try to prepare stacks on the enemy, and you will take possibly even a bad trade just to auto attack to extend them. Because right as soon as you level up, maybe if enemy's 2 stacks, you're going to do QR, and it's going to be 6. Because maybe you're going to use your W and E to clear the wave and get the level 6 before the enemy. That's a level 6 power play. So yeah, there's many variants of that. But yeah, in short, you definitely have to pay attention to that.
Awesome. I love that. Even like the idea of taking a bad trade just to set that up with the stacks. I think that is a really interesting. Wow. Let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about runes and summoners and what you run on Vel'Koz. First of all, real quick about summoner spells. What options are there, and how do you pick between them?
Okay, summoner spells. Vel'Koz doesn't require really a second summoner spell. Flash is mandatory because the game is too fast. There's too many flashes in the game, and it permits some cool plays, but it adds a layer of safety. So that's mandatory. The rest are super optional because you can easily play a game without your D summoner spell, let's say. So you're gonna take something that adds value to you in that specific setting. So let's say when you're playing bot lane or support with an AD carry who's gonna run Ghost or Exhaust, you're gonna go heal, obviously, to get max value. Mid lane, it's either gonna be versus tough matchups, barrier, or it's gonna be teleport versus controlling matchups where you want to get better resets and potential map control. And obviously cleanse versus the likes of Zoe, Syndra, TF, because otherwise you just don't get to play if the jungler is smart. So yeah, that's usually where the summoners go. There's a big misconception. People like to take Ignite, which is absolutely terrible. And there's one famous video where I think LS was coaching Nemesis, and he told him to take Ignite, and I got mad. So Ignite is just absolutely terrible on Vel'Koz because 90% of the time you should not be in range of Ignite. And even if you are, you're probably in bad positioning. So it's just not a really good tool for you. It's extremely rare to be useful versus I don't know, maybe you're playing versus Yumi Soraka bot lane, then maybe.
All right. So really, your second summoner is just going to be situational, mostly based on the matchup. Do you ever go exhaust on Vel'Koz? Like, are there any situations where you would take that?
Exhaust, I always tell people it's a more aggressive variant of barrier. Because that one requires you to be in range to actually use it. And a lot of matchups, again, people are, why don't you take that versus assassins? If you take that versus Fizz, you don't really get to use it. Because Fizz is going to engage with ult, and then he's going to E over while being invulnerable. So you can't use the exhaust before majority of the damage. Same with Zed, you really can't click on him if he does like a fast W or flash R onto you. You can't really click on him fast before he hits with certain amount of damage. And it probably won't save you in those cases. But what exhaust does do is you can use it at the start of the fight. That's probably the better use. It's not really like a safety tool, but more aggressive. So what you do is when an enemy mid laner, let's say Kiana or a Talon, they kind of jump in and they don't really have a plan to go out. But because they're this type of assassin, they're supposed to beat you in an early trade, level 3 or something like that. So instantly you would pop exhaust and then just chase them down with auto attacks punishing, minions are hitting them, you're hitting them, and they instantly can't trade and they lose so much tempo on the map. Or sometimes you will even get kills early game like that. So exhaust is one of those cool aggressive tools. But again, it's risky to take because in most cases, you won't be able to use it before you take severe damage.
Okay. And as for runes, what does your rune page usually look like?
I played Vel'Koz everywhere, all roles, even notoriously jungle. So there's many variants. I always recommend people that they go with the sorcery/inspiration. It's just the most standard, most stable variant for beginners, and you really can't go wrong because you don't lose anything by taking it. You can just get a lot of free value and resources from that. But for me, I really love on a support. I love Dark Harvest. It's just so cool. It's one of the coolest interaction spells for Vel'Koz.
Okay. So the page that you're usually running, the sorcery one, what goes into that? Why does that work so well?
Sorcery is just mandatory because it adds a layer of poke again. So you just take chip damage, passive chip damage with a lot of value, let's say on Gathering Storm, Mana Flow Ban to actually help you control the waves better, and you either go Transcendence or Absolute Focus for more damage burst. So that's usually what you run. It's just way too stable, and it provides a lot of pressure in terms of mana, in terms of damage, and scales insanely well. So on that, you build on the secondaries. Inspiration is a safer, more defensive variant where you can go Domination with, let's say, Ultimate Hunter, with the Ghost Poro, or with Cheap Shot or Taste of Blood in heavy trading matchups.
Awesome. One thing I wanted to ask about as well for the runes, which I think is probably not discussed a lot, the stat bonuses you get from runes. I've seen you use sometimes like the AP, sometimes attack speed, and sometimes cooldown reduction. Can you talk about why you switch between those?
Okay, so let's get rid of the cooldown reduction. I usually use that one as a well, mostly it was like to get the max value of CDR. It's kind of like a, I don't want to say meme because it works. It's not like you lose anything by getting it, but it's absolutely not necessary. It's a bit of an overkill to go 8 ability haste there. If you're gonna play mid lane, I would recommend it's mandatory to get attack speed. You have to go attack speed in any sort of a high-low mid lane. And if you play low velo mid lane with attack speed, you're just gonna crush opponents because they don't know what's happening. And I'll explain here why it worked, because I get this question a lot, like why attack speed feels so random. I was skeptical about it as well until I tried it. And once you take attack speed, you never go back. You can't. The wave management is way too good, because you get to do much more optimal auto attacks. By that I mean, in mid lane when there's trading between mages, there's window of hitting the minions. You always have to be hitting minions to exert pressure, because the goal is to push the enemy. So every time you're trying to hit the minion, it's a liability. You're like in potentially deadly scenario. Like people are going to try to trade you. So every time you come for an auto attack, they can hit you. But by having more attack speed, the window of that punishment is smaller, because you have less cooldown between auto attacks. So you can apply more pressure and you can get better trades. Not to mention, in early game, getting 2 auto attacks for 1 is a huge deal. Instead of having like a little bit of extra AP that's like 5 damage on your spell. So it just creates early game pressure at a huge level.
Awesome. I like that. So it's interesting that you're using that almost aggressively, but also to make it. I don't know. It has a dual purpose. You can use it for better traits, but also you can avoid taking damage from it. Is that right?
Yeah, it just fixes your laning all around. It fixes everything in your lane. It's much, much better.
Nice. Okay. Let's go into the laning phase a bit. I know you talked a bit about calculating what the enemy is going to do and what their game plan is and how you want to play around that. In general, what is your goal for the early laning phase? What are you trying to achieve?
Well, like most mages, the goal is just to push the enemy. That's like a simple goal. Now that can divert into a whole tree, like a bunch of branches, depending on the junglers, depending on the mid laners and what's happening. So let's say one example is versus, let's say, Yasuo, who's a complete counter, and you can't really do too much to him. So just pushing would be very stupid, because he can easily win volume mid push and break your push and just freeze you then. So in that case, you have to be extremely smart with how you push the waves. You either have to like fully clear them, or let them sit in a slow push towards you while you're just slowly chipping them away. So otherwise you don't get to play. You're just out of the lane. So blindly pushing in that case is very, very stupid. But in general, the role is to push the enemy, because then you get advantage. You get what we call prio, which allows you to either hit the turret, poke the enemy under turret, dive the enemy, or roam or recall. So there's many, many variants on what you want to do. And again, you have to be very, very flexible. You can't add like an idea in your head. Okay, so I'm just gonna push this guy and I'm gonna instantly rotate bot lane, because that doesn't make sense, because you don't know the state of the bot lane in that timing. So you have to be extremely flexible with the goals. Maybe the enemy is diveable. Maybe you want to call your jungler. Maybe you assume, maybe by him overstaying with low HP, enemy jungler is bound to come to mid lane, so you counter with your jungler, so you call him and then you win 2v2. Maybe you just take a easy reset out of the lane because you know you're gonna lose in the long run because enemy has some sort of sustain while you don't and you're low on mana. And there's again many variants, but in general pushing the enemy, bouncing the wave is good while poking them, applying pressure and creating map prio.
Okay, cool. So the gateway to all that is pushing the wave out. Is there a way to do that efficiently? Like, obviously, you're using your spells, but in what way are you using them to push that out quickly?
It depends on the levels. Early game, you're gonna need double W, but mid to late game, you don't use double W ever because that leaves you extremely weak. So if you can visualize this, you have four abilities: Q, two Ws, and E. So if you use two Ws, which is the fastest form of clear, you're gonna clear it, but then you're gonna get next W in about 15 seconds, then another one in 15. So you're at the semi-fighting capacity in 15 and then full capacity in 30. Whereas if you do one W, E on the back line, and Q on the front line, that's one of each, all three abilities are going to come up at the same time. So then you're going to have Q, two Ws, and then E again. So you're going to be in full fighting capacity. So let's say if you need prio mid to rotate the dragon fight. If you do double W, you're weak in a dragon fight. But if you do WEQ, by the time you get there, you have all abilities up. So that's one of those like micro things that are going to help you be much more powerful.
All right, that's interesting. I've also seen that you, when it comes to leveling up skills, you put a few points into W as well. Is that purely for wave clear as well? And how many points do you put into that? What's your logic for that?
Yeah, there are two types of playing Vel'Koz, or they used to be back in the day. It was ever since Vel'Koz came out, it was okay, Q is the main ability, max Q, fight the enemy, that's cool. But then high elo players started doing let's just max W to the way, all the way, and you get 5 points, and then you get superb wave control. And then doesn't matter if the enemy is stronger if they can never get to you because you're always pushing. You always have 6 minions in front of you. So they started losing. So then I like to believe I kind of invented this playstyle because I've never really seen it before where we do 3 points of W, then max Q. That gets you to Q rank 5 on level 10, which Q you need leveled up for kill potential, because the slow duration increases by Q leveling up, which means you're able to gap close people from higher range if you land a long range Q. So it's paramount you level it up early. But getting 3 points in W turns out is just enough to clear the waves really cleanly. Now, in matchups where you don't really need that much wave control, where you can push them easily and bully them, you get 2 points. That's kind of my variant that I do. So usually, like you could go 2 to 4 points in W, in my opinion, but 3 is probably optimal, and 2 in like some cases, because it just gives you just enough control of the wave, so you can play for kills. Now, if you were to play competitive, you would probably want a little bit more wave management, so you would go 3 points. You would almost never go 2, because competitive values wave control way more than solo queue. Because solo queue, you really want to have that queue stacked up as early as possible because you want to partake in the kills.
Awesome. I like that. Um, One thing I'm interested in is if you are like using your skills for wave management a lot, especially your E, for example, if you're using that to clear waves really quickly, doesn't that sometimes leave you vulnerable? Let's say it's an enemy Zed, doesn't he see that opportunity to just go in on you, for example, or for a jungler to start ganking at that moment? Isn't that an issue?
Kinda, but to an extent, Vel'Koz is a pathetically bad ability. It's probably the worst CC ability in the game. So sure, it does leave you vulnerable, but I don't think it's gonna stop Zed ever really if he wants to get on you. But yeah, the point is valid, and you definitely don't want to spam it randomly because a bad Vel'Koz player spam E all the time on cooldown, and they leave themselves vulnerable for 15-20 seconds. Same applies with the Ziggs. Let's say you use your satchel charge for poke, that means you're vulnerable every time for 20 seconds. So you got to be very careful with these types of abilities. So you're only going to use it if you know there's nothing going to happen. So let's say if you zone the enemy slightly with your Q and you do the W, or enemies, you just like take the diagonal approach, you're opposite of him, creating like the furthest distance away. And if you just wave clear and leave the lane without him like having a chance to fight back, then it's totally fine. So it's just about like judging on a case by case scenario.
I see. So it's fine to do as long as you're aware of it and you're playing around the cooldown.
Yeah, exactly. If you just understand well, what can happen and when.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Then at a certain point in the lane, you'll be hitting level 6. How big of a power spike is that for Vel'Koz? And can you talk a little bit about when and how you use your ult?
Is the biggest in the entire game. I'm not joking when I say I get like 60% of my solo kills on level 6 power play. It's just people always fall for that, like regardless of the elo, it's way too powerful. If you're gonna get a solo kill in lane as Vel'Koz, that's gonna be it. Now, there are, again, levels of complexity on that play. In low elo, you can probably just level it up and land a combo and one-shot people. That can work. You just do like a QEW, pop them, that's 4 stacks. If they all land, if second W doesn't, it's still 3, which gives you enough for 6 with ult, so they just die. And that's the stack overflow you do with the Q. You keep it at 4 or 7, so in case the 1W misses, you're fine. Like in that case, you really want to make that level 6 play. But then there have been more complex variants because people in a high relo are good at avoiding level 6 power plays. Like they know about that. So in that case, wave management, if you do proper wave management, and if you're running teleport, you can even do that. You can brute force a cheater recall, or if you can pull off like an actual one in the game. And you can count minions. You can count, okay, I have 2 minion experience advantage. That you can play on those 2 minions, and enemies won't be very suspecting of that. And secondly, as we talked about earlier, you're gonna land 1Q, and you're gonna slowly like clear the wave, and then you're gonna walk up and auto attack the enemy to preserve that 1 stack just before you level it up, because you're taking a bit of a bad trade because you know what's coming is really good for you. So in that sense, you prepare your level 6 power play and just try to burst them. But yeah, that's the way you get kills. It's very difficult to get a kill with Vel'Koz otherwise, unless enemies are like really bad. Because mostly you play on the wave management, pressure, and map control.
Okay, let's get into that a little bit. When it comes to getting the one shot with an ult, does it always require you to land your E, for example? What is required for you to actually get that kill?
As I said, usually versus mages, it should be enough to get 6 stacks. Mage on mage combat, 6 stacks, unless you're like behind, should usually work. If it's not, I mean, you have that internal sense when you play the game. And people will know listening to this, they kind of have that feeling like, okay, I have enough. So sometimes you're gonna think, oh, I'm 100 damage short. So you're gonna try to get that minor trade before so you can prepare that lethal. Because you want to do it in one fell swoop. Instead of like getting the enemy to 50 or 100 HP, that would be a waste. I mean, you still get pressure. You can even do that in some bad matchups. Ulting for just pressure is good sometimes. But yeah, in solo queue, you usually want to get it to 100 to 0 to capitalize on that.
Awesome. All right. Let's switch gears a little bit again, and I want to ask you about items. Now, I don't think Doran's Ring as a starting item requires much discussion, but I am curious. What does your first base usually look like?
Dark Seal, no matter what. I love Dark Seal. It's my favorite item in the game. And usually my first recall, I'm looking to get Dark Seal and Amptome. That's probably the best variant. Where you recall with that 800 gold, you get Dark Seal, Amptome, maybe a pink word, and that gives you a lot of control because that's right around the level 6 power play. And you're looking to get that kill, or you're looking to actually start fighting. Because Vel'Koz is a mid-game spiking champion, and as long as you don't die, the Dark Steel will passively stack. It does delay your Mythic, which could be really, really bad at highly competitive games, but in solo queue, it's usually fine to just have it. So yeah, delaying your Mythic for a little bit is not that bad if you cannot die and justify the Dark Steel pickup.
Okay, that's interesting. I love it. Um, do you not need an early lost chapter on Vel'Koz? Especially if you're constantly using abilities for wave management, are you not going to run out of mana?
That's a great question. When I'm coaching people, always I see that they spam way too much. Let's say level 3 and they just spam all the abilities and poke enemies to 60%. They pop a potion, they're fine, you're out of pressure. It's just not worth to poke that much. Which is why I usually also run Mana Flow Band that kind of fixes our mana a little bit. It's kind of like a good pacing tool because you want to hit enemies with abilities only when your Mana Flow Band is up, so you get stacks. You're kind of playing for the mid to late game where you're farming up mana. It fixes your laning for sure. So you can definitely get by without Lost Chapter in the first recall. You can even go like Dark Seal, 2 Amp Tomes, Boots. You can do that if you're just looking to make a kill. Also, there's a lot of tricks with the mana conservation, which a lot of people don't know about, which is Q killing the minions. If you execute a minion with a Q, you get 50% back. Also, attack speed comes into play here because you're auto-attacking the minions better, faster, and setting them up for your Q refunds. And if you execute the 2 minions, you get 100%, 3 minions, you get 150%. So you can actually farm mana by using Q. Those are a bit rare to set up, but you can definitely do that like in a very passive laning where both guys are out of ammo. You just try to set it up and you get that 150% mana. One little caveat here, one minor interaction which people are not aware of. People either believe that the Q doesn't give 150% mana, or like it's because of the passive. If your Q procs the passive and passive executes the minion, you don't get the mana back. So it has to be core Q damage that executes it. Which is why also leveling up Q early is better because you have better execute and better mana control.
Huh. That is super interesting. That's a trick I never would have thought of. Wow. All right. Um, cool. Yeah. Let's continue on items for a bit, though. For your mythic, I've seen some games where you pick Liandries, and I've seen some where you pick Ludens. How are you choosing between those? Like, what goes into that decision?
Okay, this shifts quite a bit from game to game and from season to season. So this might get outdated, but I'll give you some good concepts to decide basically on in any given scenario. So what you're looking to do is with Mythic is to gain like maximum amount of value. When enemies have no MR at all, and you can kind of know just by looking at the comps. Like if your team is full AD, you can assume enemies won't have any MR. In that case, building Ludens into Shadow Flame is phenomenal because you have do true damage to everyone because they have no MR. That's one good thing. Liandries, on the other hand, is probably the best suited for Vel'Koz because it gives you everything you need and fixes your wave clear gets tremendously better with the burn. You can also clear jungle camps so well. You can very often just by going Liandries, you can have like 250 minions at 23 minutes if you're just playing the game correctly, and you can get fed without doing that much proactively. If you build Liandries every game from now on, you wouldn't be wrong. Essentially, it's just that good. The variants are obviously if there are a bunch of squishies with no MR, you can go that burst build, that initial burst. Or in very, very rare cases where enemies are playing on that initial burst on you, you just pick up a very, very cheap item, crown, and you build like this defensive shell and you just never die. And the question is like, will you lose damage with the crown? Kinda, but then you compensate by building the first item in Magi's right after the crown. And then you just try to never die. You get that extra movement speed from the crown mythic bonus, and then Magi's at 10 stacks also gives movement speed. So you should pretty much never die if you do that combo. And you will do quite a lot of damage anyway. So yeah, that works. Like let's say you're playing versus Kiana, Evelyn. There's not much counterplay you can do there. But building crown early is just phenomenal in that case.
Awesome. I like that. Real quick, a question about Liandries. Earlier, you mentioned as Vel'Koz, you don't really mind hitting the front line. Is that the reason that Liandries is so good as well? Because you're constantly getting burn on just whoever you hit?
Yeah, it synergizes with basically everything. It's just way too good with the burn. It's good with the wave clear, good with the jungle camps. Just the fact that you can clear the wave 1 second faster, it stacks up eventually because that's 1 second of prio more on the map. And it gives you perfect stats, gives you CDR, which is technically what Vel'Koz would want. Because when you build Magic Pen, you lose 25% value of magic penetration, roughly. Because Vel'Koz does about 25% true damage overall. So building Liandries is just really, really good, and you get to spam those abilities. The core idea is to just choose the proper build path and stick to it. Like if enemies have a bunch of tanks or they have a lot of healing, you can pick up Liandries and then pair that up with healing reduction, Oblivion Orb, because Liandries extends the Oblivion Orb by 4 seconds. So it's not 3, it's 7 seconds now, and it gains huge value. So in that case, using Liandries is really good versus tanks versus healers. And the core idea is to build your build properly. By that I mean if enemies have a bunch of MR and you go Magic Pen boots into Liandries, it's pretty bad because you have only 18 Magic Pen and they have like 70 MR. You're getting no damage bonus there essentially. It's not working at all. The build, it's not synergizing with itself. Whereas if they have a lot of MR, you just go Liandries into Lucidity boots, which are cheaper, and you get more rotations in with CDR, and more rotations means more true damage and more ultimates. So sometimes in a fight you can do 2 ults, maybe even 3 if you're running like Ultimate Hunter. So yeah, like that is just you need to know what build you're going for and try to do it as best way as possible.
Okay, that's cool. I was going to ask you about the boots actually, and when you're going Lucidities. Is it just always like Liandries with Lucidities and Ludens with Sorks? Is that the logic?
Yeah, that pair up is just because the more Magic Pen you have, the more valuable it is. Because the closer they get to 0, the more damage implication it gets. So when you commit to Sorcerer Shoes, you pretty much commit to having Ludens, you pretty much commit to having Shadow Flame right after. That's kind of the build. So you have to be very careful when you choose that, because if you choose that very build and enemies all have like 60, 70, 80 MR, they basically negated your build and your build sucks. So then you have to do Void Staff maybe to recover it, and it's just all hell because you're buying a bunch of items that don't give you that much AP and that much damage.
I see. All right. Yeah, you're mentioning like Shadow Flame and Void Staff. I'm curious about legendary items in general as well. I feel like there's a lot of good ones to pick from, and all of them give you damage. Can you tell me like which ones do you like to pick up and when?
Horizon Focus is probably my favorite right now. It's the only item in the game that amplifies true damage for some reason. Nobody knows why. But yeah, the 10% bonus will apply with the true damage. It synergizes extremely well with Vel'Koz, and it has this very underrated thing, extremely underrated thing, which is vision. If you hit someone, you get vision for 6 seconds. When you're doing any sort of dragon dance, baron dance, all of these fights in the river, as long as you know the angles and you can clip one target, you get insane amount of data just by seeing where the enemies are. And very often, this happens even in high elo, you're gonna hit someone and they're gonna run around, and just as the vision is ending, they're gonna stand in one spot because they forgot that your item gives you vision or something, and then you can just hit them again or even like full combo them. So yeah, the vision part is so underrated.
That's awesome. I think once again, very on brand for Vel'Koz to build items for information. that,
Yeah.
that was very funny. And yeah, other legendary items. You mentioned Void Staff and Shadow Flame. Like, do you ever pick up both just to stack on Magic Pen, or when do you take Void Staff, for example?
Voice staff, let's say if you're doing the Lion build, which is zero magic pen, and enemies have a lot of MR, you're gonna get it as fourth, fifth, or sixth kinda in the late game. Just to amplify your build, because there are no real good endgame items in this case. You have like 3 core items, and other than that, it's a lot of optional stuff. So yeah, you're gonna pick up voice staff in the late game there. Or if you're doing the Shadow Flame build and enemies kind of negated, then you're kind of forced to go into Void Staff to recover your build. Because if you don't have percent pen, like your flat pen is just meaningless.
Yeah, that makes sense. And otherwise, you're just picking up regular items like Rabadons, I guess, as third or fourth, right?
Yeah, let's say the optimal version would be go Lion Race, Horizon Focus into decap. Like that would just be the ultimate scenario where you just burn everything.
Cool. All right. Yeah, finally, I want to ask you about the mid and the late game for Vel'Koz. So to start with that, once the turrets start to go down, what is Vel'Koz's role in the game?
Okay, that's where a lot of people get lost. Once the turrets go down, especially the mid lane turret, your role gets significantly more complex because there's many more places you could be and many more things you could do. Especially if your mid laner rotates to bot lane, does split push. So do you match the enemy mid laner? This is like a losing scenario in many ways, which is why Vel'Koz is not super highly contested in competitive because you're going to be leaking a lot unless you have an exact game plan and know what you're doing. So it makes your draft a bit constricted because you need to have like a split pusher and a dueler. But yeah, it's a bit of a competitive complexity. But let's say you're playing versus enemy Z and you beat him, you crush him, and he's 0-3. He just goes split push bot lane. Now you, as a Fed character, have to match a 0-3 character. And you're never going to kill him because he's too safe in a long lane. So what's going to happen is you're losing your most valuable piece where they're losing like a very weak Z. So enemy team gets a benefit on the 4v4. If you do that in reverse, enemy Z crushes you and he's 3-0 and you're 0-3. Now you try to match Z. He can easily dive you in the bot lane and the side lane. So enemies gain advantage in the bottom side. So it's beneficial to them either way. So split pushing is one of the core weaknesses for Vel'Koz in that sense. If you really can't control your mid lane and your bot lane is really, really like adamant in going mid lane and they want to contest that, you do the bare minimum. You catch the waves, bounce the waves properly. Good players can do this with like 90% efficiency. And in between, you're catching the jungle camps and you're playing on the windows. What that means is you're going to bounce a wave, and before enemy wave can come bot lane again, you try to make a play with your team. You group with them, coalesce, try to pressure some other tower, try to pressure an objective, herald, dragon, baron, whatever. So you play in those windows and you do bare minimum. Because Vel'Koz thrives in team fighting. You want team fights. Split pushing is really not his game.
Okay, that's interesting. So is that like the main solution? Is that just what you end up having to do if you're in the side lane? Isn't it possible to be, I don't know, to insist that you stay mid lane, for example? Is that not another way to solve it?
Oh, for sure. I'll very often do that because Vel'Koz is really good. If you destroy enemy mid turret and you have somebody who can actually match the mid lane split pusher with ease. Let's say enemy like mid laner is weak, he can't really do much. Your AD carry is farming versus him. I can easily be mid lane versus both bot laners. I can fight AD carry and support in mid lane and push them both in and control them both, which gives you huge map control. You're gonna war deep behind where the enemy turret used to be, so you get vision, and you're gonna always go left, right, and control the entry to river with really nasty invisible through the wall Qs. And if those land, you can try to pursue to go for an ult for kill, or just more likely, you're gonna poke them, get pressured, they fall back, and then you get 1v2 prio, which is ridiculously good in terms of map control. And then your team can just do whatever they want. River is yours. You can synergize and invade any side which you want, as long as you're like paying attention to other wave states.
Okay, that's interesting. So if this is such a much more optimal scenario for Vel'Koz, how come sometimes you're still relegated to bot lane? How come you can't just force your team to keep you mid?
Well, I would prefer to be mid in every single game, but there's again many variables. Sometimes you're gonna have two side laners, which neither of them can split push. No AD carry, no top lane. Neither of them are good duelers, or they're behind, or they just can't match anyone on the side. So you're gonna go and just try to match that for the sake of the team, so they don't fall apart. It's kind of like taking a lesser evil in that sense, because both options are bad. Sometimes you're at AD carry and bot lane, even though you have a dueler or they could match it, they are still like adamant in this, and they have this idea that bot lane always has to be mid in the mid game, and they will just randomly rotate from bot lane to mid without even like thinking why they're doing it. So they're just gonna be there and they're gonna boot you out because you don't want to share experience, because that's just absolute sinning, and you don't want to lose experience and gold. So what you're gonna do is you're just gonna again kind of cater to them instead of like getting into a fight and making the game unplayable. You're just gonna go bot, catch the waves, and try to force fights in between.
I see. All right. If you do end up picking up TP as your second summoner, how does that factor into all this? Like, are you more likely to keep shoving side lanes instead of like rotating between them if you have your TP up? Is there a way you can use that TP in the mid game?
Yeah, precisely. That's why TP can be good, because you don't really have insane use as a mid lane mage with teleport. You can't really like flank enemies and just run them down. But you can have it as a safety tool. If your team starts getting engaged, you can TP slightly behind them and maybe catch enemies in a blind chase. So yeah, it does definitely permit you to actually go side lane a bit more. And the biggest value of that is also you're there to defend the objectives. Let's say you go split push and you have teleport this time around. Your team gets caught and they lose one character. Now enemies really have to go Baron. In a 5v3, that Baron would be gone. But if you have teleporting and TP, and Vel'Koz is a tremendous character at defending Barons and Dragons. He's really good at destroying teams in pits. So you can teleport there, and a 5v4, they can't take the Baron. So again, it's a great safety tool for that.
Awesome. Yeah, let's talk a bit about the team fights then. You mentioned earlier that Vel'Koz is just really good in team fights in general. Are you ever looking to like catch people out as well? Do you ever look for skirmishes as Vel'Koz, or are you really just always trying to set up team fights?
Well, you're usually following the objective road towards team fights, but then again, not having a team fight is even better, because team fight is a bit of chaos where you can't control four of your teammates. You don't know what's going to happen really. Like it could be theoretically in your favor, but it's better to avoid if you can get a pick, obviously, because by getting a pick, you just skip over the team fight and you get the objective for free. So if you understand which objectives you're going for, if you understand what enemy movements are going to look like, this is one of the reasons why I take yellow wards instead of blue ones very often in late game. Whereas it's mostly the norm to go blue in mid laners late game. I will keep yellows because you can get some cheesy angles where you can actually pick off people in rotations when they're trying to contest vision. If they're in the dark long enough, even the best players make mistakes. So you just try to abuse that. You control the vision, which is why vision is key, and I always buy a bunch of pink wards. Vision is key in that sense, and you can get picks, because the best way to win an objective is to get a pick before it, because then it was just you versus the enemy, and it was like 100% your impact. Whereas in a team fight, sure, you thrive in a team fight, but you kind of lower your impact because anything can happen. Your teammate can die randomly on a side, given a reset to some character, and just the team fight is all up in flames.
I like that. Even though your team fighting potential is really good, being proactive a little bit extra helps even more.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great tool for solo queue. In competitive, obviously, you're gonna do less risky strats. You're gonna do less pick-off potential. Again, maybe you can catch him off guard if you're creative with some invisible angles, vision stuff, manipulations. Funnily enough, manipulations work better versus better players than worse because you can funnel them better into certain patterns because a lot of the high-low players think the same way. So you can kind of play on that. But yeah, like in competitive, you would play more team fight, but in solo queue, pick-off is just as valuable, if not more.
I just want to ask a follow-up question on that because that seems like an interesting thread to pull on. What exactly do you mean by funneling players? Obviously, all your abilities are great for like poking and zoning, which I assume is what you're doing. Like, how are you trying to get other players to move, and where are you trying to get them to move?
Okay, the first there's like a high-low, like a really good player goggles. All high-elo players look at the game in the same way in the map movements, in the it just they notice the slight movements where you do like the diagonal rule. If I move slightly right on my wave, enemy's gonna move slightly left to go diagonally away from me to avoid clear line of sight. They don't even think about that they do that. Whereas low-elo players don't know what they're doing. So, in a sense, you can go right and toss a Q left and precast it early, and enemies just gonna walk into it. And good players can do that very, very often. That's one of the ways you can manipulate players. One great example is I played versus Froggen on North America recently, and because Froggen is a tremendous mid laner, one of the mid laners I respect the most, I could kind of read what he was gonna do because we think alike in that sense, and I could manipulate him in a lot of like really good scenarios. Also, good players track what hits them, what doesn't, whereas bad players do same things. So sometimes for a Vel'Koz player, it's trickier to play versus a bad player. Because if I hit him 2 times in the same exact way, I'll probably not shoot the third time same way because it's ridiculous. Like he keeps getting hit. Whereas versus a good player, he's gonna shift his dodging pattern while I'm gonna shift my shooting pattern to match his.
I love it. Those are some insane mind games where predicting the dodge is just based on expecting them to do something different this time.
You're trying to profile the enemies, what their most likely dodge pattern is. And if they keep dodging the same one, you punish them twice, 3 times, and they're going to shift it eventually because they realize that they're getting hit. But then you also shift it. So it's kind of like a disarms race.
Awesome. All right. I wanted to ask one more thing about the team fights real quick because I think this is interesting as well. You've mentioned earlier how important it is to stay alive as Vel'Koz and how you don't mind just hitting the front line and stuff like that. How are you looking to position in team fights? Are you trying to always play front to back? How do you keep track of assassins, that kind of stuff? What's your logic for that?
The logic there, front to back is quite correct. Front to back is the norm in most cases. Obviously, there are variants where you're getting flanked, pincered. You got to make some tough decisions. But yeah, how do you play against that is usually when I coach people, I will tell them during the loading screen and even draft, like once you play a bit more and you think consciously about every single game, you start doing this on your own. You just see the enemy draft and you kind of know. It's like, okay, they have enemy Darius top lane. I don't care. Like he literally has no option to get me. It's useless. Okay, that's a Darius. They have Rakan bot lane. Okay, Rakan is a big danger. He's a red mark. That guy is a huge danger because Rakan flash ult combo, like run you down. You pretty much die. So he's the guy you have to keep track of. You kind of check who the danger characters are, who can get you and how. In order to position properly, you have to know which characters are dangerous to you. And they're like markers. Okay, they have a Malphite. I'm not gonna be in Malphite ult range. If he flashes ult, that's fine. As long as I'm close to my team, I can maybe flash away or even bait him. So you're kind of thinking in those terms where you just know what the positioning is based on who's up against you. So sometimes they're horrible games for Vel'Koz. Let's say if your team has absolutely zero CC and they have a bunch of assassins. So there's like no good place to stand in a massacre there. So you just build crown and try to play on the enemies, I guess. But yeah, there are these cases where you pay attention and track and just try to survive. That's the positioning. Now you can push that a step further. Let's say with the Malphite is a good example, or Rakan. You were very, very conscious about who can kill you and how. You can even put that a step further and kind of bait them to try to kill you in a position where you know you're safe. So maybe they don't know all the data, maybe they don't know your team is hiding on the side. And you can kind of step slightly forward, but not enough for them to execute you immediately. So then you can flash back, bait them. But yeah, that's what happens when you just keep track of everything, who can kill you and how. So that's the key point, to know that.
Awesome. So you're not really trying to be like aware of everything all at once, but you're just identifying like the key issues and tracking like the priorities, and that's enough most of the time.
Exactly, because if you think about everything, your brain is going to break. But that's why you shorthanded, like the characters who are dangerous. You don't necessarily need to keep track of the Garen or Darius top lane, because their only plays like run at you, flash at you. That's never really going to happen in a teamfight setting if you play properly without like some sort of flank. So it's just not a threat at all. You don't even think about it really at the start of the fight. If they come closer, you just slap them with a Q in the face.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Lastly, for this interview, I'd like to get your view on the game as a whole. You mentioned earlier that you really like Vel'Koz's support as well. So I'm kind of curious, when do you play him as support, and why do you prefer mid?
I play basically everything, and during my climbs, I resorted to AP carry in both climbs at the end to Challenger because it's the easiest way to climb, funnily enough. Mid lane is my favorite role because I used to play mid lane in amateur scene, and I love being mid lane since Dota to League of Legends. But it's just mid lane is low impact. Mid lane mages are horribly low impact. What I mean by that is I can go 5-0 on the enemy Kiana, and I might still not win the game if enemy Irelia top lane is like 3-0. She's going to have more impact than me in that game. Whereas if I lose to 3-0 Kiana, the game is just over. It's unplayable. So it's fairly low impact. Whereas, let's say I kill enemy Victor twice. Victor doesn't care. He's just going to wave clear still. He can still one laser wave clear the entire wave. He doesn't lose much. He doesn't get punished much, even if you kill him. So in that sense, it's low impact. While bot lane, when you play support, you can access the entire map and you can choose where to hit the enemies. And in solo queue, that's of tremendous value because you can find the weakest link. Maybe it's a jungler, maybe it's a top laner, and you can rotate there, try to shut them down. So yeah, also support has access to multiple targets, your 2v2 and potentially jungler. So if you win one fight or a 2v3, it's just game breaking.
Huh. That's interesting. I never would have expected mid lane to be less impact than support. That's probably going to be surprising for a lot of people.
Yeah, it sounds weird. And when I play support, I get way more kills than mid. It's just, yeah, mid lane is like you end up going 0-0-7 on mid lane and you just have perfect CS and you get perfect wave management. That's it. Whereas support, you're like 9-1 and you're just like flying through the map, poking people, destroying them.
Okay, then I'm curious kind of about your playstyle as a support. You mentioned roaming, obviously. And earlier you mentioned that you're always going Dark Harvest. Just out of curiosity, what is kind of your game plan as a whole for support? Are you really are you just trying to carry with damage?
Yeah, it's this weird take on support, which I don't really see like taking off, like or many people adopting it. But the idea is you control the map and you get vision by poking people, by crushing them. So what I will run is Dark Harvest with Night Harvester, and you obviously have Relentless Hunter there, so you have so much movement speed, and your initial Q is gonna do insane amount of damage. That's like the alternator build. Then you go into Shadow Flame, so you do double alternator. It's just insane poke on first Q. So what you do is you rotate around the map and you catch these angles because if you have sufficient game knowledge, if you know like where enemies are likely to be, you can kind of predict them. You hit them once, and if enemy support Lulu tries to ward and you hit her with a Q from 1.5 thousand distance and she's half health, she just can't ward anymore. That's dark area forever now. And then you just rotate around, you hit someone else. And the map curvature plays really well for you because every time you're doing a river gank, let's say you rotate top lane, you can do a very nice QR next to the wall, and you can gank people from over 1,000 distance range. So he's really good for sieging turrets for the same exact reason. You can dive over the wall, both in mid lane, both in top lane and bot lane. Yeah, you just wanna. The idea is to have a lot of resets, a lot of vision, huge movement speed, and control the map. That's how you play. You carry through damage, but you don't really translate the damage. Well, you do into kills because enemies eventually break, but you don't necessarily have to transfer it into kills. You can just transfer that into map control, and then you get objectives, and then your team just passively wins.
Huh. Awesome. So it's just pure pressure essentially. Cool. Yeah, just back to the game as a whole real quick. What do you think is the best way to improve at the game quickly?
Best way to improve is to start examining your deaths. Uh, as much as the best advice to play the game is don't die, because that kind of leads you to thinking of what can kill you and how, so you get to avoid it. Examining your deaths is the best way because then you can figure out what led to that death and whether it was worth it. And usually, like 80% of the deaths are not worth it in the game, and people just die randomly. You just have to look at that, and you can definitely like lower your death count. And by understanding how you died, you can learn the preconditions that led to that. Let's say you left a really bad wave, you didn't fully shove it, and then you come back and you try to break the freeze and then you die. So you can't really get better in game during that because you can't examine that. But in the post game analysis, where you have time, you can scroll back, last 30 seconds, 45, 50 seconds, and you're like, okay, if I didn't do this wave, if I didn't put it in a dangerous place, I wouldn't have to break the freeze here, and then I wouldn't have died. So post game analysis is really crucial in those cases where the preconditions are a bit more complex, and you can't really unpack them mid game.
I see. So when you're reviewing your games, are you just not even really looking throughout the whole game? You're purely just scrolling through the deaths and then a minute before that to see the lead up?
That's just a good start. When you're starting doing that, you definitely start with the deaths. When you're coaching a lot and when you're doing that, you get used to tracking a lot of things, and even like very, very minor things are gonna matter in that case. So you will definitely expand that to even the basic wave management, which didn't lead to death, but it led to lack of a little bit of experience. And that little bit of experience led to enemy getting level 6 before you. And that led to enemy poking you, you get low, you go back, and then enemy rotates bot, and then your team dies. It's like all kinds of things can happen. So yeah, it's just the causality. One thing leads to the next, and you just gotta do as well as possible. And all of these things are examinable, and you can always improve. There's always room to improve.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Earlier, you mentioned sometimes bot lane pushing you out of mid lane, even though you don't want to be pushed out. So, a question for that: how do you prevent getting tilted?
Play Vel'Koz. He's a terribly low impact champ, and you're gonna develop insane mentality by the end because that's just what you do. Like you're playing for 20% of games. 40% are gonna be won no matter what. 40% are gonna be lost. And whatever happens, make sure you're playing well. You're satisfied with your play. You can win a game, but you play like shit, and you can still examine it and feel bad about it and then learn from it. Whereas you can conversely play a game tremendously, get destroyed, and still feel satisfied and be like, okay, I did that thing right. I did that thing right. That's probably the best way to play the game. Play to get better and play for yourself. Play to have fun. Imagine everyone else is just an NPC in a game. It's like a unique scenario every single game. It's not real players, and that way you don't get tilted.
All right. I like that. I think that's a good place to end this, but I do have one last question for you, which is what is the best Vel'Koz skin?
At the moment, probably Arclight still. As much as I love the Black Frost and the Infernal, and because they have chromas. But the Arclight will just forever be way too good, and the little alterations in the voice lines, sound effects is just way too good. It's super satisfying to land any sort of ability with him.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for being on this podcast. I've really learned a lot. So thank you. Where can people find out more about you?
I stream daily on Twitch TV/Azzapp, and yeah, I make YouTube videos, Azzapp lol YouTube and stuff like that. Recently, starting a little bit of a TikTok campaign and all of this. What the Zoomers like, trying to expand my horizons slowly, but I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, usually just Twitch daily, and if you do join the Twitch, be sure to join the Discord community because it's a pretty nice community.
All right, that's it for this episode. If you want to stay up to date with the podcast, be sure to join the Challenger Insights Discord. We have an amazing community in there. You can join events like the Q&A, and you'll always get notified when a new episode comes out. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with someone who you think would be interested in it as well. Thank you for listening.